And we are live. Hi, everyone. I see we already have an active comments section. That's very exciting. As you probably well know, if you're here, today is part 3 of our male gaze series. And today we're talking about the alternatives to the male gaze, which are the female gaze or the feminist gaze, as we'll talk about later, and the queer gaze. So today, because I'm in charge, there's a PowerPoint. There's going to be a bunch of visuals. I'm well known for my PowerPoint skills. I'm here today again with Kathrin and Mexie. Hi, Kathrin and Mexie.
And
hey, everybody. We're going to go through and talk about the male gaze again, just redefine it and kind of reorient ourselves to what it is, what it means, talk about the female gaze, the queer gaze, and we're going to have a lot of visuals today and a lot of examples so that we can start to really understand and differentiate these things when we watch media. So hopefully by the end of the stream today, you'll have a really good understanding of these things and be able to take that analysis into whatever you watch after you stop watching us. All right. Okay, as promised, the male gaze. Woo! So we've talked about this, of course. If you want way more context on this, go to our first stream on the male gaze. But as a refresher, in feminist theory, the male gaze is the act of depicting women and the world in the visual arts and in literature from a masculine heterosexual perspective that presents and represents women as sexual objects for the pleasure of the heterosexual male viewer. Now, as we touched on in the male gaze stream, this can also apply to gay media. So there is the objectification of men in gay media. And as we'll talk about later with the queer gaze, just because something is gay doesn't necessarily mean it's representing queerness or that it's actually challenging heteronormativity. Homonormativity is a thing. So I just want to point that out. This definition is pretty good, but it can apply to other things, other people, I should say, and other things other than women. This term was popularized by feminist Laura Mulvey in her seminal essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema. And when we think about the male gaze, the most important thing to remember is that the male gaze is teaching us how to look. So it's teaching us how to look at others and how to see them in relation to ourselves in a way that is focused on domination. And it's important to note that when we talk about the male gaze, to fully encapsulate what the male gaze is and can be, it really needs to be expanded into, say, like the imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist, cishet patriarchal gaze.
Rolls off the tongue.
Yes. Male is doing a lot of work here, but I think that that's really important to keep in mind is that, again, it's about domination. It's about upholding systems of oppression. So when we think about male gaze, it's not just about men and women. It's about a lot of other things, and it's about the ways that, you know, the white cishet patriarchy stays on top. I want to note when we're looking... Kathrin, are you saying something?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. I want to note that when we're trying to identify the male gaze when we're watching something, some really important things to pick up on. Primarily, the male gaze tends to cut bodies up into parts as a function of the objectifying gaze. So, as we'll see in feminist media, it doesn't mean that no one's ever naked or that no one's sexy or whatever. But you'll see that bodies tend to be whole. The person's face tends to be in the scene. People are able to still be fully formed human beings, even while they may be in a scene where they're being attractive or being sexual. So what the male gaze really does is that's where you get the scenes where the camera is panning up the body or the camera is zooming in on someone's boobs or butt or whatever. So there's really this cutting up of bodies For anyone who's read The Sexual Politics of Meat, I feel that Carol J. Adams does a really good job of talking about this and how this is also applied to the animals that we eat. The underlying narrative as well in male gaze media enforces the male as the default view and centers on male entitlement and desire, again, usually in the form of domination. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that the male gaze not only objectifies, but the male gaze also orients us all to sympathizing with men, empathizing with men, and with our oppressors, because we are constantly inundated with their perspective. So you may have, just countless media where the main character is a man who's bad, who does bad things, but by the end of the movie is rewarded with his love interest and the forgiveness of everyone around him without really necessarily doing much to change. And just the proliferation of that storyline is in and of itself kind of a brainwashing the rest of us to, constantly have this empathy and sympathy for men that we let them get away with everything. So I thought, today we're going to be talking about a lot of movies and film, but I thought that this painting, which my podcast partner Mike brought up in a recent episode that we recorded together, this painting called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, is, in my terms, like a very male gazy piece of art. As we can see, we're literally in the position of the man as he stands dominant over this kind of virginal landscape. And you get the sense that he's envisioning, conquering this, developing it. So to me, this is like very male gazy, even though it's not looking at a woman. All right, I have to toggle back and forth. So let me know if any comments come up that I should address.
Okay, will do.
Okay. All right, so the female gaze, in contrast, is a feminist theory term representing the gaze of the female spectator, character, or director of an artistic work. But very much more importantly than gender, it's more an issue of representing women as subjects having agency and representing everybody on an equal level. So much like feminism, the female gaze, or Mexie, if you want to chime in, the feminist gaze, is something that we can use to create equality in how we show characters in a movie or a TV show.
Yeah, is this a good place to jump in, or do you want to keep going on this first?
Actually, yeah, I'll go through this and then maybe we can do it in the question section.
Okay.
So in contemporary usage, the female gaze has been used to refer to the perspective of a female filmmaker, screenwriter, director, producer, brings to a film that would be different from a male viewpoint of the same subject. The female gaze is not about banning sex, desires, or fantasies, but it's more about showing that these can exist without objectification. And as I mentioned, it puts men, women, and non-binary people on equal footing. And the female gaze, in contrast to the male gaze, I think the female gaze teaches us to see and to engage with people as people, rather than being pigeonholed in the viewpoint of the male protagonist or the male audience member, where even if we are not male ourselves, we're still put into that perspective. I think the female gaze is more about being open and curious to everyone that we're watching and learning to engage with them as people. So a great example of the male gaze versus the female gaze is Suicide Squad with Harley Quinn versus Birds of Prey with Harley Quinn. And we can see very easily these pictures, it's not necessarily like this picture isn't necessarily on the left, isn't necessarily showing how objectified Harley was in Suicide Squad. But I think you get a good viewpoint of the costuming differences. And in the female gaze, I find a lot of times you get a lot of the women or the subjects looking at the camera. So I like to think of it a lot too as art that looks back at you and isn't passively just being watched. So I liked this picture of Harley on the right where she's actually looking more at us and she seems to be a little bit more in control. The movies themselves, obviously, you get much more of a sense of that. In Birds of Prey, Harley gets to wear really fun costumes. Some of them are still revealing. They're all really super fun, but she gets to have more agency and control. We get to be more inside her head. Whereas in Suicide Squad, she's just this like weirdo that's really hot. And that's like all we know about her. Like, we don't really know how she feels. We get the sense that she doesn't even really have feelings. She's just crazy, you know? And in Birds of Prey, we get to get more depth to her and get to be invited into her inner world a bit more. And it's a very fun movie, and you should watch it if you haven't. The female gaze often shows the woman looking. As I mentioned, she's an active participant in her own life, and this invites us into her world. Instead of objectifying her, the gaze shows her observing, thinking, feeling, versus the male gaze, which teaches us just to look at someone and consider how we feel about them rather than how they feel. I think other good examples of female gaze media or feminist gaze media is Insecure and I May Destroy You. They both center female protagonists, but they also spend a lot of time on all of the other characters in the show. So you get to know everyone really well, and you get to understand how their relationships impact each other. And there's sex in both shows, but the way that it's filmed does not objectify anyone. So questions people usually have when we talk about, the female gaze versus the male gaze. Can the female gaze be sexual? Yes, absolutely. Often female gaze media tends to be more sensual than sexual, but it the entire point of it is, again, you're not seeing bodies that are chopped up into parts. You're not seeing one person just looking at the other, with the other person more performing or maybe not even being aware that they're being looked at. You always see an exchange back and forth between the two or more people that are involved in the sex act. The female gaze just a reverse of the male gaze? No. uh, Reversing the male gaze would be just filming, men in objectifying positions, which we certainly do see in media. And I think more and more, as we get neoliberal feminism, that's like, yeah, we can do it too. We can impress people too. But the female gaze isn't just a reversal of the male gaze in the sense of like who is being objectified. It's really about, again, it's more feminism, which is really about putting everyone on equal footing. Does the female gaze have to center women as subjects? I don't think so. I'll give an example of that in a second, but I don't think that women's stories do tend to make up the majority of what I would consider female gaze media, but I don't think that they have to. I think anyone approaching giving their characters agency and refusing to objectify anyone counts, regardless of who is the subject. And does the female gaze have to be produced or done by a woman? Again, I don't think so. And I have an example of that as well. I think just like with feminism, anyone can create feminist gaze media, and you don't have to be a woman to do so. And I think that there are plenty of women who make media that I would not consider to be from the female gaze. Mex, do you want to jump in with your hot take?
Yeah. Thank you so
your
much
spicy hot
for
take.
all of this. Yeah, I think this was really a fantastic breakdown. But yeah, I'm here with my spicy take in that I don't personally like the term female gaze, and I'll get into why. But first, I just wanted to shout out Joey Soloway, who is another feminist theorist who talks about the female gaze, and they have a really incredible keynote talk at the Toronto International Film Festival, which is on YouTube. So we'll link that below. I would very much encourage people to watch it. I think it was just like hilarious. They start out even just the way that they talk about the male gaze, like they explain it as in, you know, the male gaze is like tits, bar, tits, pina colada, waitress with tits, she's putting, you know, she's getting the pina coladas onto the thing, she's walking, tits, puts the pina coladas down, and now the scene starts, right? Like that's basically, you know, like and
we never see those tits again.
and they were just like, you know, like, yeah, like we all grew up on this, right? But anyway, so they characterize the female gaze in basically how you characterize it, Nick, and they have three kind of components to it, which they kind of took because Laura Mulvey had three components to the male gaze as well. And the components were the feeling camera, so when the camera prioritizes emotions over actions. Number two is the gazed gaze, so it shows the audience what it feels like to be the object of the gaze, and so you actually really feel that kind of reversal, like you were talking about with Birds of Prey. And three is returning the gaze, so where the person actually tells the audience how they feel about being seen. And at the end of the talk, somebody asked, like, you know, is it really appropriate to call this the female gaze? Like, wouldn't it be more appropriate to say the feminist gaze or whatever? And Joey kind of agreed and said, like, yeah, you know, like if we're talking about alternatives, like part of the reason that I don't like the female gaze is that I think that it gets confusing for people, especially because, like, in the first stream that we did, I linked an essay by another feminist about the male gaze, and in that she basically said, like, the female gaze is not a thing, and that's what we said in the first thing, like the female gaze in terms of being just a reversal of the male gaze is not a thing. But then you have a whole other group of feminists who do use the term female gaze, but I think that using that term can be confusing. Like, I got an email from somebody who was trying to understand, like, this person identified as a man and was just trying to understand, like, the difference between the male gaze and, like, what an alternative would be, and is the female gaze kind of the opposite, as you were just talking about. But I think calling it the female gaze, it kind of implies to people that it is like the reversal of the male gaze, and it also implies in some sense that if the female gaze exists, then that means that there could be some parity with the male gaze. Like in this email, I think the person's thought was that, like, okay, so maybe the issue isn't that the male gaze exists. Maybe the issue is that it's just being, like, overrepresented. So a solution could be that maybe we just have, you know, 30% male gaze media, 30% female gaze media, and 30% queer media, and then and that's it, right? And it's like, no, the male gaze is over. Like, the male gaze is done. Like, the male gaze is inherently
the male gaze is canceled. Out of here.
We're not doing that anymore. Like, the male gaze is sexist, it's objectifying, it's toxic, it's damaging, it's oppressive. Like, we're not doing that anymore.
And I do think, you know, to go in line with what you're saying, it probably would be more beneficial to call it, like, the patriarchal gaze or something,
right? Exactly.
Rather than the male gaze, because that is also confusing.
Exactly, because this person was saying, like, well, why is it? And the issue also is that, like, men just don't read feminist theory, and, like, they don't, especially
that's a huge issue.
Yeah, they don't read like, you know, proletarian, revolutionary, Black and BIPOC feminist theory, right? So they have the idea that feminism is just an inversion of the hierarchy, but they're kind of like, you know, it feels like in this day and age, things that are coded female are good, and anything coded male is, like, bad, and, like, we can't have that, right? So the idea was like, well, why can we have a female gaze if we can't have a male gaze? Like, if we can have a female gaze, that kind of implies that, like, it's okay to have a male gaze as long as they're equal, you know? And it's like, no, like, the male gaze is over. The female gaze is not the inverse of the male. Like, I think we should call it, like, the feminist gaze or whatever, if we're talking about actually showing media that is kind of, like, reversing that and showing the audience what it feels like to be the object of the gaze, like, and, you know, playing around with that, like, that could be, like, the feminist gaze. And then I mean, like, my personal thought is that, like, you know, the future that I'm working towards, or, like, the alternative that I want to see is, like, no, I want to see, like, 100% of media be alternative, like a non-male gaze, maybe you know, they suggested maybe it could be an erotic gaze, right? Like going with Audre Lorde or whatever, just something to signify that like it's not the male gaze. We're moving beyond. It's not just a reversal of the hierarchy. We're moving beyond that altogether, and we're getting to like a new place where, as you said, like if we are showing sex, it's in a way that is absolutely not objectifying of any person. It's deeply embodied. It's for everybody. It's respectful. It's humanizing. Like we're not doing the like sexist and like the imbalanced politics anymore, you know? So yeah. When I think of an alternative, like that's why I'm like, I think like to me a term that would make it more clear would be like, yeah, the non-male gaze or like the alternative or whatever, or we can say the feminist if we're talking about these particular things that like these feminist theorists have talked about. But I think I just wanted to clear that up because I think people hear the female gaze and then it just causes a whole bunch of confusion. And yeah, just wanted to give my hot take on that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think that makes so much more sense. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, I'd be really interested to hear both of your thoughts about when a feminist gaze is used, but the message that it might be trying to convey through the feminist gaze is not necessarily the best one. So I don't know, just to give an example, Jessica Taylor wrote an article where she talked about Twilight and how it had a feminist gaze, but it was portraying the men's bodies as desirable, and she felt like that was not a good thing because it was kind of equating the violence of the men as something that should be desired, and then that was making young women believe that violence and power and this kind of abusiveness is something to be desired. And I thought it was a really interesting point because it is true that a lot of the time, or sometimes, a feminist gaze can be used, but then the messaging that it's trying to convey through the feminist gaze is still like reifying patriarchal notions of violence and power. And I think it gets really complicated in that sense of, when a feminist gaze is used and it should be liberating, but at the same time, its messaging is harmful. I know that Twilight, I don't know, it's kind of controversial about how harmful it actually is. But yeah, I just wondered what you thought about that, if anything.
I mean, I could talk about Twilight for like ever. we actually did. I did a podcast on it with the Horror Vanguard because Ash, shout out, is also a big Twilight fan. But yeah, I mean, not I guess not to get into the specifics of that, but yeah, I see what you're saying, and I think that it's true. I think that's something that Joey Soloway brought up as well, and same with Nick, that like, yeah, I mean, you don't have like a truly feminist gaze can be produced by like anyone, and even things that I think, you know, are purportedly female gaze or feminist can often like miss the mark, you know. I mean, that's just true of everything. Like, and I think Nick, you're going to bring up like Wonder Woman later. Like, so many things that are presented to us as like, this is the feminist hit, this is the female gaze, this is this. Like, I think most of those fall flat.
Yeah,
like, I think there's like few media that really does it very well, right?
I would call it the internalized male gaze, not the female gaze.
Yes.
And yeah, I know Twilight's complicated, and I don't want to step into that whole fucking mess. But yeah, I do think that a lot of times people call something feminist just because a woman did it, and you know, I think we're all learning or have learned that that's not necessarily true. Everyone can perpetuate their own oppression through the art that they make. And so I think that that's why having this conversation is really valuable, so that we can get the tools to be able to analyze the media that we're consuming and say, what is this really saying? You know, and who is this servicing? What systems is this upholding or challenging? And I think that's a big one. Like, the female gaze should be challenging the patriarchy, or it's not really doing anything. You know, it doesn't have to be, you know, political necessarily, but just the text that you walk away with should be something that challenges the idea of domination and objectification.
Yeah. And just on the Twilight, I did want to mention, like, I was saying this before the stream, just how like really denigrated films like that are, because they are often, marketed towards a young teen girl audience, or even films that are considered to be for women, which is also bullshit, because it's like, things that are male gazy are supposed to be for everyone, but as soon as you have something where there's a female protagonist, or like the woman is not being objectified, suddenly that's a film that's for women and it's a chick flick, and that means that it's not cool. But yeah, it's like these films are just so put down, because it's like, oh, anything that young teen girls especially like is just considered to be ridiculous. But someone posted on, I don't know, I think it was Instagram, something that really spoke to me, and they were just like, why would women or young girls be admonished for liking like the only films in which they can actually see a portrayal of themselves that isn't dehumanizing, objectifying, like these are the only films in which women are actually treated well. They're not being murdered, they're not being raped just for the point of a plot. They're not being just grossly objectified. So like, yeah, like why would they like other media? Like, of course they're gonna like this media. Like, yeah. And I was just like, it's so true, because growing up, like, that's the male gaze is all I saw, and it was just so gross. It was like, I very often didn't like going to the movies, because I would, want to enjoy what was popular and want to go out with my friends and enjoy what they were enjoying. But I was just like, God, I would always just leave. Like, that was gross, right? Like all these comedies where the comedy itself is like just a group of guys objectifying women. Like, that's the whole joke of the film. It's just like this group of guys are together, and like what they're doing is objectifying women, and that's supposed to be funny,
Yeah.
It's like, well, why would I like that, And it's so funny, because I did have so much like internalized, like when Twilight came out, I was like, I'm not seeing this. This is ridiculous. Like, I thought it was stupid, like I thought it was laughable. And then like 10 years later, like my boyfriend at the time was like, you might actually like these films. They're like, you might actually like them. And we started watching them, and I was like, I fucking love these, actually. Like, I just like love them. And I'm like, it's just so funny, like just how, I don't know, just how that's all set up, because it's like, well, of course people like seeing things when they're not being dehumanized and objectified or just like murdered, right? So anyway, just an aside.
Yeah. And I think too, I mean, even if there are problems with this media, it's like, again, that it's because of internalized shit, and there has to be room for that to be explored without being not vilified, but without being degraded. I personally can't watch Twilight. I can't stand it. I tried to watch the first movie with my friend, and we were both like, Edward is a fucking asshole, and like, we can't do this. But I also know that there's a time in my life where I would have really liked it, and that there's other stuff that was very similar that I watched and loved, and it was me working through the shit that I had internalized. So the debate whether it's harmful or not could go on all day, but the end point is that, yeah, we're made fun of for liking stuff that helps us explore the oppressions that we live with.
Totally. I mean, like, yeah, like me having an extremely codependent relationship, like the relationship that they had, and like having such similar dynamics, like, yeah, like that, I was just like, damn, I could actually feel this. And it was like a beautiful, like fun film, so I was just like, yeah, of course, so anyway.
Yeah all right. The queer gaze. All right. So the queer gaze replaces the cishet default with a queer one, creating worlds free from the binary and full of possibility. And this is ideally. Centers subversion, consent, subtext, and recognition of oneself through others. In theory, queer gaze would deconstruct gender-based power dynamics, changing not only the object, but also the intent of male and female gaze. And ideally, queer gaze would create a world completely free from binary notions of desire and storytelling, creating space for plural identities and possibilities. The queer gaze challenges us to change a culturally enforced defaults that form our assumptions and to look for subtext. So the queer gaze challenges us to have media literacy, which is something that a lot of people don't have. And, you know, I think a lot of us YouTubers are doing our darn best to help educate the masses. But, you know, and this is why in a lot of queer media, many people will entirely miss the point. For instance, like most famously probably with The Matrix. You know, The Matrix is extremely queer gazy, and yet you have just legions of people who completely missed any of that subtext and took it as basically the opposite. And so I think that's why I love queer gaze media so much, is because I think it requires us a lot of times to pay attention and to lean in to our media in a way that we have gotten used to not doing. You know, I think a lot of us have gotten used to the way media is produced nowadays is kind of just be all in your face and just coming at you and not really asking you to like engage with it in any meaningful level. Which is not to say that it isn't fun to just, you know, watch something that's easy to watch, but still. Okay. So a good example of the queer gaze is Lil Nas X, just to change the medium, you know, makes music and music videos that are very much from a queer perspective. And I really like in particular their video Montero, Call Me By Your Name, the song and the video, because not only is it a banger and the video is amazing, but if you think about it, it's a really interesting, there's a lot of interesting layers to what they're doing with this art, which is, you know, Call Me By Your Name is a famous movie about two white men, boy and man, falling in love. I was like trying to write and I'm like, oh, I don't even know what to refer to them as. You know, so I think it's like Love, Simon, which is another movie about a white boy coming out, and it's like a very kind of homonormative narrative where it's sure gay, but it's also gay in a way that doesn't really challenge heteronormativity. It doesn't challenge the heteropatriarchy. It's something that's palatable for, you know, the mainstream. So I love that Lil Nas X uses this reference to make this their own and to talk about something, to make it more queer, to make it more in your face, and to make it really controversial. And then also with the video is also taking that with Christianity as well and addressing Christianity as, you know, you're telling me that I'm going to go to hell because of who I am. Well, fine. Then I'm going to pole dance down to hell, give the devil a lap dance, steal his horns, and now I'm, you know, I'm in charge. So I think, you know, that's why to me this is like extremely queer art, because it's not just that they were coming out as gay or as queer. It's that there's so many layers and nuances to the references that they use and why they're using them.
Yeah, just fantastic.
Anything by the Wachowski sisters is just going to be so fucking queer. Just dripping with queerness. And some of it, like Bound and Sense8, is overtly queer in the sense that you have couples that are, you know, obviously visibly queer. But then you also have like Jupiter Ascending in the Matrix, which if you look at them in one way, they look very heterosexual. But then if you read all the subtext, they're very queer.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was partly like, because yeah, I guess that was one of my questions, or maybe you have another question at the end as well, but just that like that you can have a queer gaze even if it's a outwardly heterosexual story, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, so when thinking about like the alternative, because I think people hear queer gaze and they also might get confused and think like, well, that must be queer media. But I'm like, no, like the queer gaze could just be like the alternative, and you could
Yeah.
still have like hetero media, but like through this queer gaze, which would be a completely alternative to the male gaze, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything that, and I find that the queer gaze and the feminist gaze can often coexist in that sense. And I think especially in media that does, at least on the surface, seem to have heterosexual relationships in it. Because you can look at, take the Matrix. Like, let's pretend we don't know that Neo and Trinity are trans lesbian couple. Even if we took them as like, oh, just a guy and a girl, having a time in virtual reality, we can see that like the way that Trinity is presented and the way her dynamic is with Neo is not your typical like hetero dynamic. There's something else happening there. She has, and again, that could fall under feminism where she has a lot of agency and whatnot, but there's even more to it. I think like they feel kind of the same, like they look sort of the same. There's something even more than just like gender equality happening there. And then, then obviously it's very queer regardless, and that's kind of like Jupiter Ascending, is part of that too. Like with Jupiter Ascending, it's just vibes. Like I can't even say exactly, but there's just a campiness to it, and there's a vibe to it that just has a lot of queerness and it gives you a lot of like freedom to play around. And I think that's what it's about, as much as it's about queer couples that we can see. It's really about like this feeling that you're in a world where gender doesn't matter and where possibilities are endless. And that's what's the most important.
I haven't watched these, but I'm really excited to watch them because because like it's no surprise, or like it's not I'm mixing up my words here or my metaphors, but it's very understandable. Like the Matrix is often held up along with like Alien or whatever as examples of media where women are like sexy, but they're not objectified, right? And it's kind of what's the metaphor I'm looking for? Like it's just I'm not surprised that that is media. Like the Matrix in particular is coming from like this queer gaze, right? Because it's like one of the few films that people can point to be like, yeah, this is how you can have like sexiness without objectification, is a queer gaze, right?
Right. This is how you can have a movie where everyone's in fucking leather.
Yeah.
And yet no one's objectified.
Exactly.
It's like amazing.
And then Alien is like, I think that's still more like male gaze, but like the only reason that Sigourney Weaver was treated the way that she was in that film was because her character was originally written as a man, right? So it's like, anyway.
Alien is one of the most perfect movies ever. I should have analyzed that for this, but yeah, it's a good point. Like, I think that kind of gender blind casting can sometimes lead us to something that feels queer, even though that wasn't the intention, because of that as well. Go ahead, Kathrin.
No, I was just going to say, for me, the queer gaze often is, even when they're representing like a heterosexual relationship, it's kind of this feeling that anything is possible. Like there's no set identities that the two people are having to mesh into, that like completely deconstructing any kind of binary, and it just feels like there are like multiple identities they can fit into, like just this feeling of anything being possible just outside of these constructs. And I find that really exciting a lot of the time. And you think that a lot of the time there are often some movies that are queer will cast someone who's heterosexual in those roles, and then that will often be a way of still making them appeal to like heterosexual people to watch it, and to still be like, oh, you can find these people attractive even if they're like supposed to represent a queer person. And like, not to say that you can only cast queer people in queer roles, but I think a lot of the time it is sort of done in a way to try and get like more mainstream audience to be attracted to watching it and be like sexually into those characters. And yeah, I don't know. I don't really like that very much.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, it's often the production studio, the investors, whoever will force that kind of thing. And I think that's why you get queer vibes from something that on the surface looks very like heteronormative, because you have someone who wanted to tell a queer story and was blocked from being able to do so overtly. So they had to find ways to insinuate it around the casting and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like what you brought up too. I think that's a very good point, that with The Matrix and stories like The Matrix, I think when you have this idea of people having like a different online identity and switching between worlds, and, you know, people can be one way on the inside and one way on the outside, I think that in of itself is a very queer narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, regardless of the coupling that you see or whatever, you're going to get that vibe of something very queer is happening here.
Mm-hmm. I was also going to say that I think sometimes it can feel like it's not the queer gaze, even if there is a queer couple, if within the story they're fighting or they're doing things that fit into a very like heterosexual narrative. So I don't know, say for example they're fighting for marriage rights or something like that, then even if the gaze itself is not necessarily heterosexual, it's still kind of feeding into this idea that like reifying heterosexuality by getting the characters to fight for like marriage rights, which is a very like heterosexual thing. I mean, again, I'm not criticizing like wanting marriage rights at all, but still sometimes it can just feel like it's just reifying heterosexuality inadvertently.
Yeah, absolutely. And since we're on the Wachowski slide, I want to mention that just like the female gaze can still have its issues or have its things that it doesn't represent, the queer gaze, same, depending on who does it. Like the Wachowskis have a bit of a race issue. A lot of their media can be critiqued from, you know, an anti-racist viewpoint and be found lacking. So, you know, when we talk about these things, like I don't want to uplift the Wachowskis, for instance, as people who do things perfectly, but they're just a good example of media that is just so fucking queer.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's like an issue with the fact that, like, you know, for so long our media has been dominated by white men, and now it's kind of broadening a bit, so we have like white women
Yeah.
and like, you know, like white trans people who are also in the mix, but then you get these kind of like very like white queer stories. Like what was that horrible one with Kristen Stewart recently about like the Christmas one?
Ugh.
Where it was like, it was
what
not
the fuck
queer.
was that called? I don't know, I'm blanking on it, but yeah, that was terrible.
It was really bad. But that was like, you know, the very like privileged white middle class lesbian story, you know, that was palatable to the mainstream like hetero audience, right?
Yeah, well, it was very much like if Ellen DeGeneres made a movie or something. You know what I mean? It's very much like rich, wealthy, white, neoliberal,
yeah,
kind of politics. So it's like, oh yeah, my neighbors are lesbians, but like everything else is totally the same kind of vibes. So Rin asked, so is the queer gaze a rejection of the hetero dating script or any script in general, and just going with what feels right to the characters involved, just acceptance without judgment, normativity? And I would say yes. To the second part, it's really about, yeah, being able to find your own way in the world, being able to decenter heteronormativity as the default. So that's part of why I think queer media takes a lot of media literacy, is because we're taught to just like, oh, there's these tropes and have these assumptions for how something's going to go. And queer media is like, not necessarily, you know, like if you see two people meet, you're kind of looking, you're like, oh, how are they looking at each other? How are they talking to each other? Are there, any hints here to how they feel about one another? Because all possibilities are open. Everything is endlessly possible. Same with polyamory. It's like we watch a lot of media and just monogamy is presumed. And so if you start to get something like a love triangle going, then you think, oh no, the person's going to have to pick one partner, and who are they going to pick? Whereas queer media is like, why? Why not this end up being a polycule or polyamorous or an open relationship or whatever? So yeah, it's about stepping away from those scripts, but it's really about open possibility and not being put into any particular category or box, and not being stuck in any particular category or box even once you choose one. A lot of queer media also focuses on people's ever evolving. I think Euphoria did this well because they allowed the actress that plays Jules on the show to write her own special episode. And in that episode, it was about her, she had taken hormone blockers and was presenting very like stereotypically feminine. And in that special, she talks about how she doesn't think she wants to do that anymore, and questioning if she even likes men or if she just likes her gender validation from men. So that's a very queer thing, is to be like, okay, I may be a trans girl today, but tomorrow I might be non-binary. I don't know. And that's totally fine. And I'm allowed to do that. And we saw her in season 3 wearing a binder, for breasts that like she went and got. So it is like actually a really cool representation of how our genders can kind of fluctuate throughout time, and also how the heteropatriarchy influences our own perceptions of ourselves and can complicate that journey to figuring out who we are and how we want to move about the world. Because that's what she talked about a lot in that special, was the fact that like she had it in her head that she needed approval from men and she needed to look a certain way in order to be accepted as a trans woman. And then realizing that that wasn't true gave her more possibilities in how she could express herself and identify.
I'm also wondering, like CM in the chat brought up a while back about like asexuality and like aro as well, and like if a queer gaze could also be looking at that as well, or like having two people meet and it's like maybe they end up just being platonic friends, and that's fine, like because we never see that, right? Like it's always just something that's super
Always.
sexually charged, often for no reason, right? Or people are shipping people left and right or whatever, but it's like, well, maybe we could just have media where like the plot doesn't revolve around that, or like they end up just being platonic, or maybe they end up like in a relationship but it's not sexual, or because we never see that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and media does a lot of harm by representing a sexual romantic connection as the ultimate connection that you can have with another person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why it's really hard. Ship culture is very complicated. And again, don't fucking at me. I'm not getting into it. I said nothing about Twilight and I said nothing about ship culture. Don't come for me. But I think that's part of the difficulty sometimes with shipping people, is that for a lot of us, like, we see two people have a really good or interesting connection and that's all we can imagine for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that for them to become a couple.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I don't want to say like shipping people is wrong. I don't think it is, but I think it's just hard sometimes when you're someone who can see other possibilities for people, and then the media is impacted by that. So I think, and I'm glad that the Ace Arrow stuff was brought up, because it can be hard. I think a lot of queer media doesn't really represent that very well, and does focus on sexuality as a big part of the queer expression. And so one of my favorite shows, why am I blanking? Oh my God. She-Ra, there it is.
There it is.
The new She-Ra series, was great, and it was very queer, and it was cool that like it was so casually queer. But spoiler alert, but like I won't say which two characters, but two of the characters that I always read as Ace Ace Arrow ended up becoming a couple kind of out of nowhere in the last season. And I think it was more like in there's like a flash forward to how things are a bit later after like the final events. And I was just like, why did we need that? But I think that again is the pressure of, and maybe I was reading asexuality into them. Maybe they weren't actually ace, but ooh, can we get some
There's some
naked clothing? All right, I have blocked that person. Wait, and what the hell is naked clothing anyway?
Yeah.
Anyway, I was very upset because I felt like, this is a very queer show, and this is a queer show for children. And I think that it's really important to see that you can be just friends with somebody, and that can be just as satisfying and just as important as anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that like no one should ever be friend, or no one should ever date either. It's not to go the other way, but it's just that it just felt like that was the vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt very forced to me that these two characters were suddenly in a romantic relationship when none of us had really thought that that was what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it also unfortunately kind of retconned and reframed some of the difficulties that they had had in their friendship before as a different sort of jealousy. Whereas I thought it was really useful for them to work through these issues as friends, and that being the dynamic, to show that like just because you're jealous your friend's spending time with other people doesn't mean it means that you're in love with them. That's something that I think a lot of people have experienced just in friendships, and like that should have been represented in that way. So anyway.
Yeah, and it really irritates me because then a lot of the time that feeds into real life, where there's this idea that, oh, you can't possibly just be friends with a man. And like I've just continuously found that men that I've tried to just be friends with seem to be incapable of purely seeing me as a friend. And then when they can see that there is no sexual possibility, a lot of the time they're like just not interested anymore in like any kind of friendship, which is very objectifying. And I also hate how that feeds into like young older men with younger women kind of narratives, where it's like you rarely ever see any depictions of like just platonic friendships or relationships between an older man and a younger woman. It's always with some sort of sexual or like weird component. I remember watching The Intern, and where it's just like a very wholesome relationship between a younger woman and an older man, and being so freaked out by it because it was so uncommon to just like have a non-creepy relationship between an older man and like a young woman. And I was like, wow, this is actually possible. And yeah, and I just get really frustrated when everything always has to be so. Yeah, we live in such a sex-obsessed culture in so many ways, and like that's so harmful for ace people. And it's just, I don't know, it's anyway.
Yeah, like Danitron says, if it's not romantic, then it's the friend zone, and that's bad. Like you came up with that.
Exactly.
And Rin said that there's a film called Zucchini, and it ends up with them being queer platonic partners, and that's the best thing. And that sounds really good too, because it's like, yeah, it's one thing. Like I think definitely more people should just end up as friends and have it just that like normalize that, but also normalize like maybe they do get into a relationship, but they're not just like immediately having sex, or maybe they don't have sex, maybe they're not like making out all the time or whatever, but they're still partners. Like we just don't see stuff like that, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I tried to pull some Ace Arrow clips for today or screenshots, but I was like, it's kind of a hard thing to depict visually, especially in a short period of time, because it's almost like a lack of what's happening. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I mean like it's hard to show all the nuanced in interactions with each other. One clip I did try to find, and I couldn't figure out what episode it was in. It's somewhere in season 6 of Elementary, which is one of my all-time favorite shows. And I think, to me, Elementary is a very queer show, even though on the surface it's not like canonically queer. But I think one of the reasons, to me, it is a very queer show is the relationship between Watson and Holmes is, in my eyes, very Platonic. It feels very queer Platonic. And there's this scene where they have this really fucking intense conversation where he, spoilers, she wants to adopt, and she's worried about their lifestyle together and how having a baby would change that, and assuming that he wouldn't accept a kid because he's, Sherlock Holmes. And he tells her, like, you're my family, and if you want a child, like, we will have a child together and we will do this. But it's not in a sexual way and it's not in a romantic way. But they're also, like, they even say they're more than friends, they're more than partners, but it's not romantic. And I just think, for me, I was trying to find that clip of that conversation just to show, like, this is a really intense, amazing example of what, in my headcanon, is an aromantic relationship between two people that is extremely loving. For both of them, it's the most important relationship in their lives. And yet they're allowed to never, they kind of tease it sometimes throughout the show, and I think that was probably forced by the network. But, like, you never really think that they're actually going to get together. Like, that's just not how they are. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really cool. And it's something we need to see way more of. And we just need to see more just friendships in general. And I think we kind of are, but just friendships in general being shown as, like, equally important to any other relationship in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, yes, this is about Elementary, my favorite show. I could talk about it all fucking day. But yeah, it was funny because I was thinking about, like, I want to include some, like, ace representation, and I was like, it's kind of hard to, like, pull a clip of that to show it. Mm-hmm. But it's very cool when you see it, and I think that those representations are also really important because they usually come with conversations. Like, those, I think, more than any other relationship, highlight the act of talking about what you want and what you don't want and negotiating a relationship structure with another person. And I think that's really important for people of all sexualities to see. Mm-hmm. Is that you don't just jump in and make assumptions about what you have. Like, you talk about it and mm-hmm. you really figure it out together. Like, what do you both want, or what do you all want,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if this is the best time to bring this up, but I wanted to talk a bit about the queer gaze and how it intersects with our views of nature, decolonization, and other things like that. Ooh. Or like talk about that later.
Let me see. Oh my God. Well, I was gonna say wait for this slide, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I haven't fully fleshed this out very much, but I read this statement by the filmmaker Simone Jakiriuma-Patau, and she said that queerness is not just an identity, but also a perspective of the world and environment. And there's this example of Daughters of Fire and Tace Gisola's The Whisper of the Jaguar, and I haven't actually seen these before, and essentially they're trying to make the argument that the queer gaze also can be applied to how we view nature and decolonization. And I'm just going to read this out because I think it's really interesting. So in these films, The Whisper of the Jaguar is another film that extends the female gaze and the queer gaze into the unstable landscape of nature as a queer woman journeys across the Amazon, engaging in orgies under the influence of medicinal drugs. She experiences visions of her late Brazilian trans sister as part of the forest and borderless animal world. Here, the queer gaze becomes part of a decolonizing structure, an act of liberation that unsettles historic power relations. Connecting with all those around her, human and non-human, she orgasms from all the women in her family who have been deprived of pleasure by oppression and colonization. There's a beautiful moment when her sister undergoes a shamanic transformation into a jaguar, dissolving the gendered boundaries of the world, and I assume like the non-human human binary as well. So a queer gaze then can upset power relations by blurring gender binaries. It can also challenge notions of female or male bodiedness, either by opening up the relationship between gender and bodiedness or by objectifying fixed notions. Anyway, I don't know. Like I said, I haven't fully fleshed this out yet, so I'm curious what you all think. But I think that's really interesting about how, yeah, the queerness kind of intersects with relationships to nature, decolonization, how the orgasms and the queer gaze relate to anti-colonialism and things like that. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it definitely does. And that's why, as we've been talking about what we should call things instead, I think like a decolonial gaze would definitely be part of this. Because, I think queerness is tied into all of that. I mean, queerness done completely and done well is tied into not just, gender and sexuality, but just all of the ways that we have, all of the ways that we could and should transverse borders and destroy borders around us. I think in Queering Anarchism, that's what they talk about, because anarchy also wants to destroy borders, and queerness can be a practice that helps you blur those lines on your path to destroying them. And I think for sure the disconnect between us and nature is something that was instilled by the cishet patriarchy, and is something that, in queerness, I think having that freedom to reconnect or to express yourself in these natural ways is a big part of it. Do you have any thoughts, Mex?
Not anything. I agree. I think you both said that really well.
Yeah.
I would need some time to think about it.
Me too. But I think because, I think a lot about there's a lot of connection between things like witchcraft and witchy practices and magic and queerness, so I think there's a lot of connections there to the kind of thing that you're talking about, of that, expanding back out and reconnecting to nature.
Yeah, because I guess I was thinking about how during the transition from feudalism to capitalism, how we became so disconnected from our bodies, and then how that disconnection from our bodies means that we don't really know, it's hard for us to figure out our queerness, and then also that's the period when compulsory heterosexuality became a thing, just to get women into the monogamous relationships to keep us reproducing and all of this. And so I don't know, I think it's really interesting how all of that intersects. So yeah, the more that you can adopt a queer lens, the more that you can become connected to your body so much more, the more that you're able to subvert capitalism and colonialism and all of that conditioning from since that transition. And so I guess it does give you a completely different lens through which to view the world in general, which then relates to how you see so many other how you see so many other issues in general. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I guess I will say that was really well said. And I think that, because we know that violence against the land is often so connected to violence against women, and then also violence against, the racialized quote unquote other. And so we've all been so inculcated with the male gaze, and basically the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie has basically, dictated to us what our sexual preferences, what our desires, what our fantasies are, you know, through capitalism, through media. And it's, you know, it's unsurprising that, you know, understanding how capitalism works and how patriarchy works, it's unsurprising that like the kind of things that are presented to us that now make up like a lot of our fantasies, like it's unsurprising that those are all very, you know, objectifying, degrading, dehumanizing, and really about like domination and oppression, right? And so if you can actually like really like decolonize your mind from all of that and learn to see through these alternative gazes that are humanizing and that are about connection or whatever, I do think like that does have a big impact on like all of these other forms of oppression that like, yeah, like if your mind is just geared towards fantasizing about that kind of oppression and dehumanization, then I think that obviously would feed into all these other kinds of oppressions that happen to the land and to other people as well. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So questions we get with the queer gaze are similar. So is the queer gaze just a reversal of the male gaze in terms of like, is it a reversal of the straight gaze? And again, no, I think that there is media that is that. I think there's gay media that is basically just a reversal of straight media. And it's equally problematic. You know, the continuation of objectifying people isn't liberatory because the dynamics are gay instead of straight. And, you know, again, it should seek to challenge and disrupt the heteropatriarchy. So just being a reversal wouldn't do that. Being a reversal, as Mexie brought up earlier, you know, kind of puts them on equal terms and makes it seem like both are valid. They just need more of one and less of the other. Is anything gay automatically the queer gaze? Probably just answered that, but no. For instance, I finally watched Love, Simon like, I don't know, a year or two ago. And I was like, what the hell is everyone talking about? This movie sucks. And I could get into a whole thing, but I think the biggest reason for me, and I read some article about it later that was talking about how, you know, like we know that, was the main character's name Simon? Anyway, whoever the main character was, we know that he's gay, but he's gay in this very non-sexual, non-threatening way. And he is otherwise, you know, white and middle class and all these other things. So it's not challenging anything. It's more like, oh, let's expand the borders of like who is in the in club a little bit, you know, like let's let gay people into the cis hetero patriarchy. But yeah, you know, and there's this character in Love, Simon who's like a black femme queer person and boy, I'm assuming. And it's just like amazing to me for an example of like why I hate this movie so much. So we'll call him Simon. I don't remember if that's his name, but because I can't remember if that's his name or the other guy's name. But anyway, Simon sees this kid getting bullied every fucking day and just walks right past him. And then later, basically, they're presented in the narrative like they're the same. Like Simon gets bullied very mildly at one point, and then it's like, oh, now we're the same. And it's like, you're not the same, though. You walked past this kid. You never stood up for him. You never did anything to protect him. You watched him get bullied in this way, and now you've like been teased once, and now you're like, oh my God, you know, like I'm a victim of this thing. And it's like, you're not. Anyway. But yeah, there's no, so like in that movie, there was no analysis of how a visibly queer Black person would have a different experience of life, that their experiences were not the same just because they're both gay, I guess is my point. And that's where a lot of gay media falls short a lot of times, is in things like class and race and other issues. It just presents gayness as like the one challenge that you might go through in your life and has no like deeper analysis on other people's perspectives. And again, is gay in a way where the cis heteropatriarchy can be like, all right,
Yeah.
you know, like we'll let it slide.
Yeah.
And then how does the queer gaze tie into queer baiting? I think this is a very interesting question that I came up with. But I'm so ridiculous. Anyway, I think the queer gaze ties into queer baiting because I think what happens in my eyes is that what is happening is that there is something queer subtextually going on, and sometimes this is intentional and sometimes it's not, and people are picking up on that, and then people obviously exploit it, right, to like tease that something might happen to keep a queer audience engaged, but also to not piss off a straight audience. And so I think like sometimes it's intentional from the gate, but I guess my point is like sometimes something queer subtextually is happening and then fans pick up on it, and then producers, directors are like, oh, they think that this is happening, so now we're going to run with it. But we're only going to bait. We're not going to actually like do it. And I think this happens in a lot of media. So the answer is like, how does it tie into is I think that there's subtext there that can come through. This happened most famously, I think, recently with Luca. Luca is such a queer story, and every queer person who's seen that movie is like, oh yeah, this is a queer story. And then the guy who wrote and directed it is like, absolutely not. This is about me and my friend when we were kids. And we're all like, well, maybe you two were gay. We don't know. But like something queer is happening here. You know, and it wasn't just the relationship between the two little boys that was gay or queer feeling, but it was also the narrative of like, oh, when I'm in water, I'm a monster. When I'm out of water, I'm a human. And like, if people knew I was a monster, they would reject me and hate me. And so I have to hide that part of myself. It's like, that's very queer. So these things can come through even when they're not intended. And then a lot of times queer baiting happens when people are like, oh, this is coming through for our queer fans. So like, let's just stoke the fire a little bit and keep them interested, but not actually do anything with it.
Like Star Wars.
Yeah. I also think sometimes queer baiting is like used to keep a male audience titillated by like, oh, these two women could be into each other, and like then like it's a very like male fantasy thing, but they only want it to be like a fantasy as long as like she will then come back to them and like be interested in the cock. So yeah,
there's always the like murderous bisexual woman trope where it's like her being bisexual is part of her being like edgy or evil or whatever it is, but then she always ends up with the man in the end. So her bisexuality is never actually a challenge to anything. It's never actually something that has to be grappled with. Yeah, I could go on and on and on, but I won't. All right. I thought I turned off autoplay. I hate when it does that. So content warning, I'm going to show 2 videos of people kissing. They're just kissing. But I wanted to talk about, I mentioned before that the queer gaze is really interested in consent. And I think the feminist gaze as well. And this is one of the areas where I think there's a lot of crossover in different types of media. And as we've talked about on a previous stream, consent is a tricky thing. There's a lot of ways, you know, to get consent. We always teach that everyone should get enthusiastic, verbal, very clear consent. But I think something that is very comfortable and very commonplace in queer spaces as well as in queer media is the fact that it is very difficult sometimes to get clear verbal consent because you don't know if the other person is going to reject you or even hurt you if you were to so boldly state what you wanted. So you see in a lot of queer media that there there are these subtle ways that consent is conveyed. And I think these two clips really demonstrate that quite well. And I think part of also why I wanted to bring this up is because a lot of female and queer directors think very hard about the intimate scenes that they're asking their actors to do. And they think a lot about how to make the actors comfortable on set and make sure that everyone has consent and no one has to do anything they don't want to. But they also think a lot about how to convey consent on screen as well. And we'll see that especially in the second clip. But I think these demonstrate really well vibes. I wish I could have shown this whole entire like 10-minute sequence, because I think, I don't know, it did a lot of things that were interesting, but obviously I can't show like a 10-minute clip of a show. So we're just going to watch them smooch. But if you don't want to see smooching, look away for the next 2 minutes. And I couldn't play sound because they will get you on the music. But these two boys go to a bar. This guy's friend was like, "Oh, I'll take you somewhere where they'll serve us," because they're underage. And they start goofing around, joking, dancing to one of their favorite songs. And then they end up embracing. And now you can see that this is how they're getting consent from each other, where there's the slow buildup, and then they pull away. Oh, the best scene. And they kiss for the third time, knowing now that they're both okay with it. And this guy here is like, "Yep." Like, yep, we could have called that. So I feel this scene is from Euphoria. And again, that show is a fucking dumpster fire, but sometimes it does stuff well. And what I would have liked to show in the build up to this moment is that there's a lot of moments like this that to me are very queer and very well done. And then there were also a lot of moments where they would just show a dick or show someone's boobs. And I was like, you're just like interlacing the male gaze with the queer gaze, like every other frame, basically. Mm-hmm. But you can see here how like these two boys, and you would know from the whole, sequence of events that like there's clearly something there, like they're presented to us as best friends, but then there's all these moments and vibes where you're like, what's going on? And then it builds up to this moment where they go to this gay bar, and this is how they end up kissing each other. And there's the lingering pauses and the pulling back after kissing to like check to make sure it's okay, and then the coming back together is like very much a queer kind of representation of how consent and communication can happen when you're not sure that you're able to openly express yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like in a sexy way that isn't just like how it's depicted so often, like we got to take out our contracts and like go through them all or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why I like that scene too, because it's the kind of show where I would have maybe expected them to just start like fucking or something, which like would have been fine. But I thought it was just such a better choice to choose them kissing and then showing the one guy like almost weeping with relief of like, this is something he had wanted so badly for so long, but like could not even dare to like ask it. I just think it was so much more of a powerful moment. Mm-hmm. All right, and then all of the gays will know what movie this is.
Oh, I love this film.
But this is Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and the director for this movie said she had them wear these coverings on their face so that the actors could choose when they were going to kiss, and so that it could visually be represented that they were both giving consent. Because they pull their own mask down and then they kiss. And then there's the looking to see if it's okay, and she runs away. But don't worry, we find out later it was totally fine. And the blonde one was the one who sort of instigated the incident. So even though she runs away, you kind of know from what the buildup was that it's probably more because she's overwhelmed than it is that like that wasn't the right thing to do.
I love how it
just
just shows how utterly erotic just a kiss can be, and how
yeah.
It just moves so much away from just like the penis and vagina stuff, and like just how much of amazing, like the sensuality, and I love it so much. And also I feel like a lot of the time I think the Take on YouTube did a really good video about the female gaze, and they mentioned something about how often the female gaze will have an emphasis on like mouths and like licking tongues and licking lips and things like that, and like things to do with the mouth, and how that related to the fact that a lot of the time we get much more pleasure from like someone going down on us, or like using the mouth, as opposed to like the hyperfixation on the penis being the thing that causes us pleasure, when most of the time, or a lot of the time I should say, that isn't actually the case. That actually a lot more for us comes from like the mouth being used and like someone going down on us than from penises. So yeah, I love how there's like the focus on like mouths.
Me too. I like watching people make out, and I just like too the passion and intensity and the buildup that can happen with that. So much of going through these kind of things was about, it really is about the gaze. And the interesting thing in like feminist and queer media is how much looking there is by the subjects. Whereas you realize, I think especially after that pop culture detective video that just came out about peeping Toms, which I highly recommend to everyone, even though it was hard to watch that many clips of like gross shit in a row, is like how often the object is being looked at without even looking back, or with us not even seeing, in most cases, her face. And what in something like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, so much of it, if you think about it, is them looking at each other and us like watching them look at each other, which I think is really interesting, and just is so much about connection and this buildup and nonverbal communication that can happen between two people. Which I think is quite spicy and much sexier than, someone just grabbing someone else and being like,
ram.
Yeah, exactly.
Ram.
Even for a kiss, it's still the same kind of like, oh, how many times is it like the guy grabs the girl's like head or face and is like, we're like making out now. And it's like, but I want that slow, like hesitant, kind of thing. And I want the soft, like start.
And it like zoomed in, so you're really like getting it,
Yeah, get up in there.
Yeah.
And I also love how they convey the vulnerability of the looking, because I actually think there's a lot well, I guess it depends on the person, but I think for me, a lot of the time, I feel much more vulnerable when I'm like making eye contact with someone, or expressing that kind of, where I'm expressing that I like someone on an emotional level, which often comes through the way you're looking at someone. And that kind of intimacy, because I think we just don't really look at each other anymore, like look people in the eyes. Like I often think about that, like how often do I actually look someone directly in the eyes? There's something so deeply intimate about it, and so uncommon. Whereas I think that a lot of the time it focuses on the male gaze media focuses on like the vulnerability of sex, although they don't often convey it as particularly vulnerable. And actually, I don't know, I just really enjoy seeing depictions of the vulnerability of like eye contact. And I honestly think that our culture in general probably finds it easier to have the vulnerability of sex in general, because like we're so taught into that kind of hypersexuality, as opposed to the vulnerability. I think most of us, or many of us, would find the vulnerability of that kind of gazing and emotionality actually much more difficult. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Well, I think that's like like one of the hallmarks of the male gaze is like to separate intimacy from sex and separate vulnerability from sex, so that like, because a man, it's like like in this, like in masculinity, like you're not supposed to be vulnerable, right? So and like having sex with another person, like looking them in the eye and like, you know, having that connection, like, you know, climaxing with them, like that is one of the most vulnerable things that you can do with another human person. And that's like a hallmark of the male gaze, is just completely strip that away and be like, no, there's no vulnerability here. I'm gazing at you. I'm not vulnerable. You're an object. Like it's only vulnerable if the person can gaze back at you and like and meet your eye and like and be there with you. Like that's where the vulnerability is. So like if you just completely take away their gaze and make them an object, then you don't have to be vulnerable. Like your gaze is everything. And then you can just use them like just a mechanical using their body to ejaculate, basically. And like that's your fantasy. Like your fantasy is not being vulnerable, right? Like
absolutely.
Yeah, I love that.
So note, I think I've covered this already, but it does not necessarily matter who's directing something or writing, etc. Something can be male, female, queer, gazy, or not. Regardless, it's about the final product, not the producer. I think I maybe forgot to put it in here. I can pull it up if I did. But I have a clip from a movie that was directed by a woman, but as far as I can tell, she's a straight woman, and yet the movie was very, very queer. So, you know, and I think that's like ultimately what we're hoping for and building towards. It's kind of like how we always talk about, you know, we need more opportunities and resources and funding and jobs given to marginalized people to tell their own stories. But even within that, like if you're trying to write something that is realistic and representative, you're ultimately somewhere along the line going to be writing or directing about a subject matter that you don't personally experience, you know, in order to tell a full story or have like a full cast of characters. So I think like in all ways on the left, the work that we're trying to do is to get to a point where we can accurately, at least to some extent, represent other things that are not our own things. And that's what this is about here, is like understanding the feminist gaze, the queer gaze can help you incorporate that into your own work, even if those are not things that you are. Well, you should be a feminist.
Yeah, you should be a feminist.
Yeah. All right. So as examples, we're going to bring up Wonder Woman. So both Wonder Woman movies were directed by a woman. However, I would classify them both as still very male gazy and certainly still very like pro-military, very white feminism, et cetera, et cetera. Wonder Woman 1984, I think particularly was queer-baity. You had the sense that there was some chemistry between her and Cheetah. I forgot what her pre-Cheetah name was. And we know that canonically Wonder Woman is bisexual, and yet you would never know that from these movies. Not only is her bisexuality never even hinted at, but she spends like, I don't know, decades hung up over the same dude, and like was the first guy that she slept with and then couldn't get over him. And it's like, give me a fucking break. If I was Wonder Woman, I'd be banging everybody. Like, I'm young and hot forever. Are you kidding me? Gonna be spreading this all over the place. But it's a good example of like, just because a woman directed, and you know, to her credit, I'm sure there were a ton of restrictions on her of what she could do. So like, who knows if she had free reign, what the end result would have been. But what we got was certainly not what I would consider to be truly like feminist gaze.
No.
And was not queer gazy at all, which it absolutely should have been, because the main character is queer.
Yeah, like having like strong women who just like kick ass the way that like a male superhero would, but also they're a supermodel and like and
literally
and like the camera's like hugging their body while they're kicking ass. Like there's nothing feminist about that. I'm sorry.
Right. And we won't even get into Gail Godot. Is it Godot or Godot? I hear everyone
it's Gal
say
Gadot, I think.
That's what I thought. Gal Gadot, you know, her political leanings in real life, like that's a whole other fucking thing. But yeah, it's just not like, sure, her costumes, like if you compare them to the movies that were not directed by her, maybe like are slightly more practical and slightly less revealing. But even though, like, it really shouldn't be about how much skin you're showing necessarily. It's about how you're framed, how you're shot, what those things say. Because again, you could have feminist or queer media where people are absolutely like butt ass naked. So it's not about how much you're revealing. It's just about the way that that's shown and the way that the camera is gazing and teaching us to gaze. And I feel like in those movies, you're still getting the pans up her body. You're still getting these certain shots that highlight like her. And I mean, yeah, they literally cast a model who frankly can't act very well because that's what was more important, right? Is how she looks rather than like her acting abilities.
Yeah, and you can have like a badass woman who's a fighter and all of these things, but still have it not be male gaze if it's like portrayed in a different way. So it's not necessarily even about what she's doing.
Absolutely. I didn't include it in here, but I think Black Widow, the Black Widow movie, is a good example of, I do feel like that one is much closer to a feminist gaze than Wonder Woman is. Because you have, you know, female characters who have the core kind of motivating relationship is a pair of sisters in the movie. And you have like, sure, they're still wearing outfits that are like cool, but they're not being objectified by the camera for the most part. And there's even jokes within the film. Like her sister asked Black Widow, she's like, why are you always like launching into these poses when you do moves and stuff? She's like, who do you think is watching you? And it's kind of like this, in a way, it's kind of this interesting critique of the male gaze. Is like every time Black Widow does something, you know, she lands in a certain way and like flips her hair back, and her sister's like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, that looks so weird. Why are you doing that?
That's actually interesting. I haven't seen that film, but yeah,
it's pretty good.
It reminds me,
as far as these things go, it's pretty good.
Soloway's kind of like returning the gaze like trope or whatever of like kind of like flipping it and being like, yeah, why are we gazing at you this way?
Right. To my point about it doesn't necessarily matter who, like what the identity of the person who made something is. And also to my earlier point that the feminist gaze can be applied to characters that are not female. Ava DuVernay's When They See Us, which is a movie that destroyed me. It's really, really good, really powerful, very hard to watch. But she tells about the story of the Central Park Five, which were 5 boys and what happened to them. And even though the subjects of the film are boys and then men, I think that this for sure is a feminist film. It's very, you know, anti mass incarceration. It's very anti-racist. It's telling the story of these boys in a way that I feel is distinctly feminist, if not female, in the sense that the story doesn't ever try to make us feel comfortable with what happened, and there's no hero that we can root for. It's just something terrible and systemic, and that's front and center of the story. Whereas they feel like if a man made this, he would be trying to find like some white lawyer, detective, or somebody, you know, someone to focus on to try to give us hope and make us feel like, oh, well, not all white people are bad. And this is also a function of Ava being a Black woman as well. You know, you get that viewpoint of there's no white saviors in this film, and there's nothing there to make you feel really comfortable or help you walk away. There's a slightly like optimistic ending in the sense of you find out what happened to the boys and like how they've grown up and where they are, but you just have to fucking sit with it. And I think that in that it's very feminist. I would say it's very specifically Black feminist, even though it's about young men.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as I mentioned, my favorite movie, Bit, was directed by a cishet dude. And I was shocked when I looked that up because I just watched this movie. I think Sophie from Mars recommended it somewhere along, I saw it in one of her videos, and I was like, oh, let me look that up. And I just watched it. And then when I was done with it, I was like, who directed this? And then I found out it was this guy. And I was like, really? I was so surprised, because I feel like the film has a very like female and queer gaze to it. And when I read up on the director a bit in interviews he did about this movie, that was very intentional. He was like, I want to have a trans girl be the main character. I want it to be about this lesbian vampire gang. And he had a lot of thought and care put into, I want to represent this character's gender identity as something that's important, but also not a personality trait. It's just a part of who she is, but it's not her core feature. So he did a lot of work to make sure he was writing her as like a full human being who happened to be trans, which is how it should be, and just seemed to do a lot of work to really decenter the male gaze and heteronormativity. And I thought it was really fucking great. There's a little bit at the end where I was like, okay, I can kind of see like the resolution to everything. I was like, I can kind of see how a guy wrote this. But for the most part, I was like really impressed that a cishet dude made this movie.
This looks great. The tagline says, let men be the ones who are afraid to jog at night.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting premise. And the premise is, how is the naked clothing back? Naked? It's not naked clothing. Where did I get the word clothing from? Block user. Okay. The premise is essentially, what if vampirism was something that you could use as a way to have a power to like change the power imbalance? So what if vampires got together and were like, only girl vampires, no boys. And then this becomes something that like women have and men don't. And I was like, that is actually kind of fascinating. Instead of it being like a virus or a disease or whatever, it's like, oh, what if this is our way of like taking power back? And would that corrupt? Would that even things out? Like what would happen with that? So like I said, I think the ending could have been explored a little bit better, but it's still a great movie that I highly recommend. All right, audience. So since I'm a trainer by craft, since I'm a teacher, I want you all to participate in this game. I have some images for you to look at and a video clip, and you're going to tell me what gaze it's coming from. And Kathrin and Mexie, you can play along too, since there's at least a 30-second delay on the comments.
Okay.
So, ladies,
this one's too easy.
We have these two beefy men. This is how I reinforce learning. It's like, let's go through some worked examples, and we'll start with something easy. So yeah, we have these two beefy men. Is this the female gaze? Because we're looking at these beef bodies.
I want to give the audience a second to try.
Oh, sorry.
They're nailing it.
Can I just say that I think this is such a good example of what I think we talked about in a previous stream of what men think that we want compared to what we actually think is attractive, and how completely different. Like, I don't know many people that would really want what I'm seeing on the screen. Like, that does nothing for me. But it's that kind of idea of what we're supposed to want, and then men think that if they go to the gym, then we'll find them attractive. I don't know.
It's like, it's a male fantasy. Like, it's a male fantasy to be the alpha male.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, look at them. Holy shit. Yeah, I want to be them. Like, I want to go to the gym. I want to be the alpha male. So it's like, it's still a male fantasy. It's still a male gaze. And like, objectification in the opposite isn't feminist.
Yeah, and
So
it's
the
just
audience
a
nailed it.
way. The audience got it. I'm so proud of all my little babies. You did such a good job. We talked about this more in the male gaze stream, but yes, one of the reasons that reversing the male gaze in terms of objectifying men instead of women doesn't work is because when you look at when it's done, it's still so obviously from the male perspective. Like Kathrin was saying beautifully, that's exactly it. It's a male fantasy of what they think women want, and also what is needed to keep like capitalism going, right? So we're seeing objectification of men happening more often nowadays, but that's because it's profitable. The same way it's profitable to make everyone else feel bad about their bodies and want to have unattainable goals. You know, this is gym memberships and protein powders and workout equipment and workout clothes and like on and on and on, right? There's money in perpetuating this as something that is desired. And then what happens to us people who date men is we try to tell them this is not even what I want, and then they won't listen because they're so inundated with images like this that they can't believe that someone would be happy with someone who doesn't look like that. But I'm with you, Kathrin. Like, that is not my type. It's not anything I'm interested in. And one of the funniest stories I have kind of tied to this is a friend of my ex's that I went to high school with was telling me that a couple of her friends, like after high school, got really into working out together and they got all beefed out. And then they were, so they did it to like get girls' attention, but then they started getting asked out by girls. And then they were like, could never go out because they had to be in the gym to like maintain their physiques. So like girls would ask them out and they're like, oh, I gotta go work out. I can't go out with you.
That's so funny.
And it just shows you what a trap the whole thing is. You know, it's like if you're not, some people are genetically predisposed. The last guy I dated actually was like could eat anything and just spend like an hour in the gym and like look like like he was actually a bodybuilder. But for most people, it's like, you know, it's just like trying to be thin. It's just this thing that you're constantly having to work on all the time, and it's exhausting.
And I mean, like, you know, like it's also like no shade to people who look like this, and like, you know, I've dated bodybuilders as well. Like that it is a nice body. Like I'm not gonna say like it's not attractive or whatever. It's not like it's like unattractive, but it's still like this portrayal of it is still like coming from that male viewpoint. Like it's still portrayed as this male fantasy, and it still perpetuates the patriarchy because it still perpetuates this idea of like the alpha male, you know?
Exactly.
So it's like maybe you know, maybe some women are attracted to this or whatever, but like that doesn't really matter because the portrayal is still from the male gaze, right?
Yeah.
So, just wanted to say that.
Yeah, and it's just a representation of what all men should look like or what masculinity means in a way that's extremely harmful. So exactly like you're saying, Mex, like even if some people look like this or like that, fine, whatever, but that shouldn't be the expectation for man. Like the entry point to manhood shouldn't be this,
right?
You know, because this is not actually realistic for most people. I mean, The Rock, like, I don't know if you guys have heard what he fucking eats in a day,
this
but like
thing, honestly.
I mean, it's not a way that anyone could live if your entire job wasn't literally looking like this. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and like to your point about the profitability and like all the how that kind of gym culture is like a $1 billion industry, and all like the protein shakes and all of that, and like how that then reinforces like meat consumption, like exploitation of animals, and then the more like you emphasize power, power and strength and being stronger than the next, and then how that reinforces like domination over and all of this, and like and then I think that really feeds into as well so many like toxic masculine traits of putting down men for like not being strong enough or like being weak, and then like that kind of competition, and like the more like so much competition over bodies and stuff like that, and then that feeds into competition and capitalism, and it's all connected.
And entitlement, because I know if men work this hard to look like this, then they think that it entitles them to women. And even if they're not so overt in their thoughts, like that is ultimately what's happening, is like you're told, you do this, you get this as a reward. And I've read accounts by people, like I read, I can't remember where it was, but I read this one kid basically was talking about how he is disabled in some way. He didn't specify how, but that, you know, girls wouldn't talk to him. And then he started working out all the time and got really jacked and started getting dates. And it's like, you know, and just taking the wrong message away from that is like, yeah, it's true. Like you have to look this way, or you have to look a certain way, or girls won't talk to you, which then gets you into the whole thing of like, oh, girls don't like guys because of how they treat them. They just like them because of how they look or what they have. And it's like, sure, maybe that is true in certain cases. You know, women can objectify just as much as anyone else, but it doesn't mean that what is happening is just what should happen, you know?
It also just, it's not that's like, it's still the male gaze that they've internalized.
Yeah, it's still the male gaze, it's still the patriarchy, and you know, then it just becomes a cycle of like, oh, well, these girls are so superficial and blah blah blah, and it forwards this like gold digger narrative and this shallow narrative and all these other things that stoke these contentious fires between men and women. But it's like, but you're self-selecting, you know what I mean? You're going after people who are going after you based on your looks. Whereas like you could have less dates, sure, but like wait for people who actually like you for who you are, which is how I live my life, which is why I've been single for like 4 years, very long time.
That's only way to live. Only way to live.
I mean, honestly, I'm fine with it, but yeah. Anyway, it just makes me really sad because I hear someone like that, and I hear someone who's vulnerable, who feels rejected by society, and I think there's some truth in that, especially being disabled. But it's like, unfortunately, because you've had access to media, you've been inundated with the wrong lesson, you know, and it's lesson now that's being reinforced by how you're being treated by other people. And I don't feel that at any point you're going to like step back and like learn the right lesson, you know?
I also had an experience where a man that I dated for about a year, when I first started dating him, he wasn't really that muscly, but he got really into bodybuilding and like really, really into it over the course of our relationship. And it was very interesting because I really think that he completely transformed the way that he would have sex with me based on his body. And I'm not saying this is always the case, but there was a distinct difference between the more sensual beginning of our relationship, which may just be as a result of the fact that it was the beginning of the relationship. I don't know, and he was making more effort to actually make me come. But at the beginning it was more like on an equal footing. But then when he got really into his body image and into like very, very muscular and everything, it became a very pornified sexual thing where it was very much about domination and control and male gaze, etc. And I really wonder to what extent, once you see yourself as that like pornified image and like that alpha, and the more that you put effort into your image, how that then translates into the way you have sex. I feel like there's probably some kind of correlation there. At least in my experience, there's definitely been a correlation there.
Yeah. Well, I think from my experience with like eating disorders and exercise bulimia and stuff, it's very hard to be in that head. And I'm not saying he necessarily had that, but I think having to be so rigid with what you're eating and when you're working out puts you in like a weird headspace. And I think it does make you really, really susceptible to objectifying yourself, objectifying other people, being way more judgmental and critical of other people. And it doesn't surprise me that the dynamic shifted as he had that physical transformation.
Yeah, I guess the more rigid that you are with your body in terms of what you allow yourself to consume, or like how you control your body, the more you control your sexual expression, and the more like, rigid. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
I mean, I can speak from experience, not just for myself, but for my other friends who are anorexic as well, that like we took very little joy in sex. We were preoccupied with how we looked, you know, during it the entire time instead of being present with what's happening. And also some of the meanest people you'll ever meet are anorexics because they're hungry. And because in order to like punish yourself that much, you just have to be so, it just causes you to be so critical of other people. And I know for myself, I was so much more like fat phobic and judgy and everything else when I was not eating. And, you know, I think it makes a lot of sense as to why. And I think, you know, for a man, you know, getting in shape like that, like I said before, there's just so many, like, I'm sure the way people were treating him changed. And there's so many expectations put on you of like, oh, I have this kind of body now. This is how I should act, or this is what I'm entitled to. And that's how it was for me too, is like the thinner you get, it's like, oh, you know, I'm supposed to be happy and I'm supposed to get all this attention. And these are the things that I'm supposed to get as a trade-off for putting myself through this like torture. Flashbacks to darker times, friends. But I was thinking about that because I remember like my best friend and I basically lived together way back when, and we both had pretty massive eating disorders, and we were enabling each other. And like she used to just say the worst stuff about people, and I would just be like, dude, like you can't say that. But at the same time, it like made sense to me because I'm like, she's so tightly controlling herself and she like hates herself. I'm not saying every anorexic hates themselves, but like she just like hates herself so much that it's just like externalized constantly. And you can't be soft with other people because then maybe you'll be soft with yourself, and then you'll stop controlling everything so rigidly. And, you know, I'm sure for him, it was like, oh, I have to like be macho and I have to like be doing these things to keep up with this whole routine and everything. Or maybe not. I could be projecting on him, but it makes a lot of sense to me that that would be something that would happen.
No, 100%. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, kids, this one's slightly trickier. Whoop. So at first, it was so funny when I got this online. I thought someone had put this there, and I forgot like to block her vagina. But then I remembered that that was part of the movie. So we have a beautiful naked lady in a somewhat seductive pose. Is this the male gaze I see? While people guess, I'll look at comments. I like this one. As a lesbian, so much of what I'm attracted to is care. Actual sex, the main thing I think I desire. Cooking for each other, massages, buying flowers for each other is what I desire. I love that.
Actual sex is not. They did an asterisk.
That makes more sense. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, I think that's probably more people than we realize, than like people themselves realize, is like you really want like for me it's the vibes. I just got to have like the vibes and the eye contact and the communication and the feeling of safety, and then I'm, you know, I need that before I can even think about having sex with somebody.
Sorry, the cat is back.
Oh, cats. Latasha. So Latasha said, I'm going to still say male, but maybe my ace brain is confused. I love that. So people are mostly guessing female gaze, and then they're saying could be queer as well. I would say I'm leaning on the side of feminist. I think this is one of those spaces where there's crossover. between like feminist and queer gaze. But I think what we see here is like, she's beautiful, she's very sexy, but at the same time, we see her looking, and we actually can see from the reflection that she's not being looked at. So instead of looking at her body for titillation, we're actually looking at her lover, drawing her. And it's a really intimate moment between them. And we're just, even from this shot, we are invited into her internal world. You can't have the context if you haven't seen the movie, but I'm so just working from the image, like we can see that she's looking at someone who's not looking at her, and just seems very comfortable and relaxing, even though she's exposed in such a way. So yeah, I would say it's mostly feminist. Go ahead, Max.
I was going to say she also has armpit hair, which Paul says the armpit hair disqualifies it as the male gaze. I'm like, yeah, that's true. And also it's like, she's just like a normal person on a bed. Like she's not like naked for no reason and like, I don't know, like, moving her body in a way that's just very pornified male gazy,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Like she's in a kind of seductive pose, but it's one that like, I think all of us have been in this pose. It's just like what you do when you kind of roll over and you're like looking at someone.
Exactly.
So it doesn't feel overly staged. And she's not, like arching her back or like doing something ridiculous to get attention. And she is with her lover, so it's like okay for her to be a little seductive or sexy because she is with her lover, but it doesn't feel like it's for our titillation. It feels like we're witnessing a moment between them.
Yeah, and you can't really see that much of her breasts either, and usually that's like, you normally see like that's one of the main features that you see. And I also think it's interesting that you see more of her like lower stomach as opposed to like the tight waist or whatever that you're supposed to usually see. And I like that there's like an emphasis on the vagina, even though like you can't really see it, because a lot of the time that isn't really shown that much.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, it is in a way almost kind of awkward when you look at it. Like it's a little awkward that her lower half is uncovered and then has this mirror in front of it, and that her breasts are covered, which are usually, like you were saying, what would be the main focal point. It's beautiful, but it is also like almost kind of awkward in a way that I think makes it really interesting. I also love the the visual metaphor of like her head and her vagina post sex. Well, very well done. So I've got one last thing. Okay, I paused it.
My least favorite movie of all time.
I know. So I wanted to include this because I think this movie is a little tricky. It's one at some point I probably want to do like an in-depth analysis of, but it's a movie that I think, well, we'll see. We'll go through it, but it's a movie that is trying to do a thing, and I think it's very contentious online whether it achieved that thing or not. So we can argue about that. But this clip that I pulled was, to me, the most shocking and outrageous part of this whole movie, which is saying a lot. And I want us to use all the things we learned today, look at all the little visual cues, and see what gaze we think that this is from. And I couldn't include the music because that's usually where YouTube brings the hammer down, but the music that's playing during this scene is very if I had to give it a mood, I would say it's like music of like discovery, and it's a little joyful or hopeful, I guess. So the music that sets the tone, because I think when you watch it without the music, it seems like a fucking horror show. But the music being played during it is supposed to convey like that this is like a moment of empowerment and revelation. All right, let's dig in. Can I play it this way? Okay. And I had to clumsily blur stuff, so that's what that is. And for those who don't know, the movie here is Ex Machina, which I think I forgot to say, but I wanted to include a clip of because it was asked about in the male gaze stream. Also spoilers. And I didn't include it because this clip's already long enough, but I forget the main character's name, but he was like looking at her while she was doing this.
Mm.
Ugh.
Ugh.
Mexie, you and I are not doing a very good job. I'm not giving the answer away. Okay, so that was the scene. No, I don't want to play you again. We've seen enough.
Seen more than enough.
Rin so far nailed it. Male gaze, literally pulling body parts off. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not objectification, what is? Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to point out that in this scene, right before where I started the clip, she opens the first door and there's this white android in there. And then she ends up going to the Asian android and taking her skin and her body parts, which I thought was especially, it was already bad, but then that was especially egregious.
Yeah,
and I thought the scene where they
racist.
pull back and you can see both, and that like who she chose was particularly chilling.
Yeah, that movie, like, not only being like super male gazy and just like gross and stupid and I hate it, was also really
Mexie,
racist.
please don't hold back. I really want you to feel like you can just let it
Like,
out.
I just like I could talk forever about how much I hate this film. But anyway, it was so racist because like it was supposed to be this feminist thing, but yeah, she like sells out all of the androids, the women of color, and like they just get killed and like left behind, and so that she can triumph. And I'm like, this is so gross.
So gross.
Yeah.
I also felt like it was like an incel fantasy or something, or it was like an incel storyline, because it's like, oh, this nice guy helps her the whole time and then she just like leaves him to die.
Yeah.
And I know some people in chat are saying they like haven't seen this movie, so they don't know the context, which I think is okay. But yeah, just to give a bit of context, like Mexie said, essentially you have this android who is built by this guy and kept in captivity, and finally makes her escape, and she chooses to do so by like literally going to his closet of other androids and like taking their body parts in order to make her escape. And the thing about this whole clip that bothers me the most from the perspective of the male gaze is her running her hands over her chest and body as if it's always someone's. It's like this idea that it's this trope of like vampires, or we saw this in the Eternals movie, like these people who are kept eternally childlike, desiring to be sexual and desired. And that's what that felt like to me. It was like, oh, I'm coveting her skin so I can like, and because I had to blur them out, but like you can see here that she doesn't have like nipples, right? She has the shape of a breast, but she doesn't have the external covering of a breast, and this android did. So she's like literally like coveting this other person's skin and body in order to be, fully human, fully woman. It's just always this gross, like, to me, it's like what men fantasize about, that like, of course, a girl would feel this way, it's like, oh, I want to like have nipples and whatever.
Yeah, and like run your hands over your own body and whatever. Like, it's like, ugh.
It's like how guys think girls have sleepovers where they just have pillow fights in their underwear all the time. To me, it's like very in line with that kind of male fantasy. Of like, of course, girls just stand around and like touch their bodies and just be like, oh, I just want to like be attractive to the male gaze.
Yeah. And then like this android, it's like she's just naked there, like being completely objectified. Like again, like the camera's like going over her like face and whatever. And yeah, it's just like there's nothing good about this movie.
Not one thing.
I don't know if you mentioned this already because my thing cut out, but I also think it's an incel fantasy in the sense that like I think a lot of incels would love the idea of just like a robot woman at home that they can just like use whenever they want and like not actually a real human being. I mean, these things are actually being designed now. I don't know if they actually properly exist, but we have all of this currently, all these like sex dolls and everything being created at the moment. So yeah, I think it's like fantasy in that sense, especially since the men that were depicted in that movie were like incels themselves. So
yeah, and it's just such like a tired trope. It's like, like really, do we have to see this, you know? And then have it be portrayed as like, oh well, this is just a normal thing. Like, yeah, of course men are doing this. Of course men want this. And it's just like, I'm so tired of this. Like, you know?
Yeah, that's exactly how I felt. I was like, ugh, enough already.
Yeah.
Okay, I had one last that I forgot to actually put in the presentation. It's kind of dark, so we'll do our best. It's just a dark scene, so hopefully we can see it. So last one, kids. This one should probably be pretty easy, but tell me what gaze you think this scene is from. Why is it so dark?
I'm having a hard time seeing it.
Let me see. Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, well, I guess that ties into it, like just like the stories that we're tired of and like the gays that we're tired of. I just want to shout out Joey Soloway again, who in their talk, which we'll link below, was talking about like the way that the male gaze treat sexual assault, which we've talked about in other streams as well, and just how disgusting and like titillating and unnecessary it is, usually from the male perspective. And Joey was just like, yeah, just that's definitely a trope that we're just done with. Like, we don't need to see that anymore. Like, if we feel like we need to write scenes or depict scenes of sexual assault, like we will do that. But like, men, like, please stop writing our rape scenes for us and then just showing it back to us, you know? And it's like similarly with this, like, like this incel narrative, like, yeah, we don't need to see that depicted. It's just we're done with that.
Yeah, I also think that I think we wanted to bring it up at some point, but like the Handmaid's Tale, and I also think the Underground Railroad movie did such a good job of depicting sexual assault and from a I don't know if you'd call it a queer perspective, maybe, but from a female gaze perspective. And I really enjoyed that because, yeah, it's not that those things cannot be depicted, but you don't need to show it in such a hypersexual way. And like with I think in both cases, they were fully clothed. You didn't see any of their body parts. They were just basically, like depicting the horror of it from the perspective of the women being raped, as opposed to from the male perspective, and in a way that like eroticizes the violence. And yeah, I thought that was really great.
Yeah, I think the really good thing that The Handmaid's Tale did was that like the camera, like most of the time the camera was on her face. And so it wasn't like titillating her body. It wasn't making the experience. It was actually showing, like, you could see her disassociating through that. You could see her pain and her trauma like through that. And you actually cared about it. And you were like, holy shit, this is hard, you know, hard to watch.
Yeah.
as opposed to like the way Game of Thrones handled it, for example.
But Mexie, that was necessary for the storyline.
Right. I forgot it was historically accurate.
All right. So for whoever could see that video, yes, I think Queer Gaze is what I would pick. And that is the movie The Power of the Dog. First of all, I really liked it. I'm kind of obsessed with it in terms of cinematography. It had a very female queer gaze going on. In terms of even, I almost pulled a clip of like the way she films the mountains. They almost look like they're made out of velvet, and you just want to reach out and like touch them. Like they look like they would feel soft and fuzzy. And she films horses, and it's just so sensual. Not like you want to fuck a horse, but just like you almost feel like you can smell the sun beaming off their fur and like the warmth. It just like it was such a like sensual in the term of like sensory experience. And then yeah, there's just this like really intense subtext running through the whole thing that you're like, whoa, this is intense. Highly recommend. But yeah, that scene is really interesting to me because not only was there this, again, nonverbal consent and kind of dance going on, a lot of eye contact and like implied meaning and subtext, but it's also a scene that signals a shift in the power dynamics in a way that, if you've seen the movie, is like quite interesting. So in a very queer way too, like you are like, oh, you know, who's in control now? This is interesting. So yeah, that's pretty much what I've got. I did have a slide here. Let me show it. Is it? Okay. There we go. So yeah, you all mentioned The Handmaid's Tale. And I second everything you said. And I think The Handmaid's Tale is a really good example of, I do think that it is very much from a feminist or female gaze, but it is explicitly a white neoliberal feminist gaze, which we could debate if that's even feminism at that point. But yeah, there's a lot in the show that was handled well in terms of the sexual assault and things like that. And in terms of also helping us to understand what the women were actually experiencing. But then it's handled so poorly in so many other ways. And I think particularly in the way that they handle race and how a Black woman, for instance, also like trans women are just not talked about. Trans people apparently just don't exist. So they do talk about gay people, but they never talk about trans people. And I feel like for a show that's literally centered on gender, that's very turfy to me and very suspect. So anyway, it goes to show that like you can sometimes have a gaze, or you can sometimes do certain things well while still also participating in things that are harmful. We could talk about the others, but I'm curious for you two if there's any last thoughts that you have or any particular pieces of media you want to talk about. And also people in chat, let us know if there's any particular piece of media you want us to talk about or you want to say something about.
Yeah, I don't think I have any other pieces of media that we haven't covered. I was thinking when you were talking about the queer gaze, I was thinking of Moonlight, which I thought was like quite good in terms of like what we were talking about in terms of like really portraying that vulnerability. I felt like that was a movie that like you really felt the vulnerability of the characters in their like sexual experiences. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought this was amazing. I love your PowerPoint. Thank you so much, Nick.
Yeah,
this was like so awesome. I hope everyone loved it.
I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I think George, you were asking what movie. The Power of the Dog is the movie that that last clip was from. Highly recommend. Yeah, and I think, hopefully this was interesting, and hopefully this gives everyone a good analysis to go forward with, and if you didn't have it already, and to view media with. Like, for instance, I think sirens. It's the patriarchy trying to silence me. Okay. I put 500 Days of Summer on this list because I think it's one of those movies that you could say is critiquing the male gaze, but I feel like it is still from the male gaze at the end of the day. But I think it would be a fun one to like watch with friends and analyze and pick apart and see like what you all think the end result of that movie is. Like there's conversations about the Zooey Deschanel's character, Summer, and if she's a manic pixie dream girl or not. And a lot of people say that actually she comes across as one, but she's actually not, because she has her own, background and experiences and wants and desires. But I did watch this movie again, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I just hated it. I was like, and that for me is typically my barometer if something is the male gaze or not. If like I fucking hate it, that's how I felt about Ex Machina. Like when I watched it, it was like I'm just angry, and that tips me off that like something's going on here, even if I can't articulate it yet.
Same.
I think you're both really great at picking up on these things, because the first time I watched that film, I was like, oh, this is a great film. But they always leave me feeling like terrible about myself, like my body or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that is a good barometer. But usually I'm like, oh, this is a great film. And then it's only after I hear you talk about it, I'm like, oh, yeah, you're so right. And I think it's like, it takes training to like figure out when something is the male gaze and when it isn't. But yeah, that general feeling of like not feeling good about, like that's how I felt about Euphoria. It took me ages to figure it out, but I always felt like shit after watching that, and I was like, oh, like, but at the same time I was like, oh, I love this, but then I was like, no. If I feel like shit about myself, if I dislike my body or whatever after I watch something, this is not a good experience. Anyway, I think it probably just like, I'm now having the lens to like look for it, I'm going to be way more able to pick up on it now, which hopefully this whole stream helps with that, with other people as well.
I hope so. All right, kids. Well, did we do it?
We did it.
We did it.
We completed the series. I love the series. I'm so happy we did this.
If you love the series, please share it around. I created a playlist that has the 3 in it. I think the most shareable one is the first one of the male gaze, and then maybe if someone's still interested, they can watch the other 2. But yeah, we've just really loved doing this together. It was super fun, and we love sharing it with everyone, and we hope it's a good resource for people.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you so much.
All right, I don't know what we'll be back with, but it'll be something next month. All right, kids, until then, bye.
Bye.
Bye.